If you're interested in genetic genealogy, you might have seen some of these genetic reveal videos on YouTube, or with Hollywood celebrities. Or maybe you yourself have been curious and decided to take the plunge and discover who you really are. DNA commercial testing in recent years not only has become affordable and accessible, but a huge market, especially in America. A few years back, there was a commercial with an American gentleman who once thought his ancestry was German, but after doing the DNA test, he actually discovered he was Scottish. So, as he said, I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt. Not only is it costly to trade in traditional ethnic costumes at the drop of a feathered Bavarian hat, it might be unwise. If your knowledge of your own ancestry is so flimsy that you could change your identity with a click of a mouse button, I would suggest that you do some research about genetics. Many people without genealogical paper trails have turned to these companies to answer questions about paternity, adoption, and has also helped African Americans find and claim an identity where they come from, and after many centuries of it being denied to them, a thing that European and Asian Americans can take for granted. In this episode, I want to explain Italian genetics and also compare some of these DNA companies. Genetics is a growing field in science, with implications for health and anthropology, and has turned over presumptions of past ancient history. At first, many archaeologists were skeptical and wouldn't even consider the faintest possibility that this new science could overturn their lifetime's work. Now, however, archaeologists and geneticists are working together, and the outcome has been a torrent of archaeological genetic studies and books that are being published, so many that it is hard to keep up with the latest news. Let's start from the beginning. The godfather of genetics is undoubtedly Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza. Born in Genoa, Italy in 1922, Cavalli got his MD at the University of Pavia and was appointed to a research department in Cambridge. He would later work at Stanford University in California until he retired. He started a new field of research using blood types to map migrations and demographics of human populations. Other pioneer population geneticists like British Stephen Oppenheimer, the late Brian Sykes, and American Spencer Wells, the starter of the Nat Genomic Project. They have often made a lot of wild claims before much of the sequenced ancient DNA could be analyzed, compared, and understood. Much of the information on population genetics has evolved because techniques have improved with extracting DNA from ancient bones. Now, the foremost in the field are American geneticist David Reich, with the majority of news coming from David Reich Labs, and Swedish geneticist Svante Pöbel, the latter being an expert on Neanderthal genes. Also, the late Gene Manco has written some interesting books that has helped this subject become more accessible and mainstream. 3 ways we categorize ancestral and population DNA is through mitochondrial DNA, Y-DNA, and autosomal DNA. mtDNA, as it is also called, is the DNA located in the mitochondria, which is the fatty nucleus of a cell. This is unique because we can trace this DNA from our mother, and her mother's mother, going back to the first mothers, or hypothetical Eve, as it is sometimes called. We can calculate the mutation rate of change in the mitochondrial DNA and separate them to make what we call mitochondrial DNA haplogroups. These haplogroups we can categorize and group them and trace their migration from the original in Africa to their spread in Eurasia and the Americas. Each haplogroup we can subcategorize into clades to understand the age better. Then there is Y-DNA, which is passed down from your father, from his father going back to the hypothetical Adam in Africa. Y-DNA is calculated through what is called a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. Subclades are determined by a terminal SNP. The further down the Y chromosome phylogenetic tree you calculate, the older the branch of a particular Y-DNA. Given the nature of men in history, Y-DNA is sometimes introduced in ways like war, rape, and subjugation. That is something we must be aware of. And finally, autosomal DNA. This makes up the majority of our DNA. Autosomal DNA is made up of 22 pairs of autosomes and 1 pair of sex chromosomes Y and X. This is what DNA genealogical companies use to tell you where you come from. Okay, so here it is. This is my list of companies I believe to be the best for Italian Americans. I've tested with all of these companies that I will mention, starting from the worst. So, in my opinion, the worst is either MyHeritage or Living DNA. MyHeritage has a major ethnic labeling problem and could give you a really bad impression. They just updated recently, but mine and my mother's results are still quite ridiculous. They offer family tree services, which is nice, and they have a large international market, so you can connect with a larger group of people, or cousin matches, if you're doing genealogy. Living DNA's target audience are Brits, so don't expect anything revealing by them yet. My next is Family Tree DNA. They have updated their results as well, and seem to be a little better than MyHeritage, but they often confuse Middle Eastern and Jewish DNA with South Italians, which can give the wrong impression if you don't have a paper trail and don't understand the science and history. FTDNA also offers Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA, and the possibility to purchase SNP upgrades to better understand your paternal or maternal heritage, which is great, but also be prepared to spend hundreds of dollars on something they do very poorly in explaining. They also have something called Ancient Origins, which is terribly outdated, but could be something fantastic if they focused on it. Next up the list is Ancestry. Ancestry has been updating its results constantly and trying to find genetic communities, which in my mother's case was right on the nose. It's fairly accurate most of the time, but I think it would be better if they stopped using terms such as France or Spain and individualize the regions. They offer interesting info, but fall short in that regards, and tend to dumb it down a bit for the customer base. They're better known for their family tree building and genealogical research search capabilities, which come at a price, but are very useful. And my favorite so far is 23andMe. 23andMe is, in my opinion, the best of the bunch. My results were spot on, and they divided them up into regions such as Campania, Molise, etc. They also offer health, Y-DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and how much Neanderthal you are. Their family tree capabilities are pretty bad, so don't expect something like Ancestry in this respect. Then there are My True Ancestry and GEDmatch. My True Ancestry is a site that compares your ancient DNA to yours, and so far it has been accurate. Some of their labeling might be misleading. For example, they have a Philistine sample in the Middle East, but reading the genetic papers, this Philistine sample was actually closer to Sardinians and Italians. But this isn't mentioned as far as I know. However, overall I am happy with it because it offers so many features while educating the customer. Expect to pay a lot for upgrades, which is a shame, but besides that, a very interesting site. GEDmatch is a genetic calculator. You can upload your DNA on the site, but your privacy might be compromised. Police in the past have used it to crack unsolved murder cases by comparing DNA to the murderers. Okay, so here is what an Italian might expect for his results depending on the region they come from or company they choose. The term Italian is complicated because who are they using as the reference? Maybe Central Italy? Some label it further north or further south. But let's start from the north. If you have ancestry from the north of Italy, your results should have a mix of Italian. Okay, hopefully the company differentiates north from south. It could have French, Spanish, or British if you are, say, Ligurian or Piemontese. And maybe more German, Balkan, or Slavic if you are from, say, the northeast, like in the Veneto or Friuli. If you are from Emilia, Romagna, Marche, Umbria, or Tuscany, you might also get some Northwest European. Further south in Lazio is similar, but possibly some more southern shifted results, especially in southern Lazio. In Abruzzo, Molise, Campania, Puglia, Basilicata, and Calabria, you might find some Balkan, Greek, or West Asian, and maybe very small amounts of Slavic, Northwest European, and possibly North African or Middle Eastern. This is truer the more south in Italy you test. In Sicily, it is similar to South Italy. Their histories were indeed intertwined for several centuries. North African might be higher here, especially in the west. However, Northwest European is also higher in the west of Sicily, probably due to the Norman conquest, and because Palermo was the capital. Sardinia is the black sheep as usual. They share the least of the continent's DNA, and have more similarities with Corsica and its Neolithic past. However, the North Sardinia and Corsica had seen a major migration from Tuscany and Genoa, and even the dialects there are derived from a kind of Tuscan, Genovese, Corsican mix. These areas should show elevated Italian ancestry. The Spanish and Catalans were there for centuries, especially in the west like Alghero, so one could expect Iberian ancestry. The south half of Sardinia, especially Cagliari, was colonized by Carthaginians, and also Genoa, so you might expect some North African and possibly a little North Italian DNA. The center of Sardinia and Barbagia and the rural Sardo-speaking villages around the island will harbor the most non-influenced outsider DNA on the island. All in all, on the peninsula of Italy, there is a cline from north to south, much like you would find in North and South Germany or in other countries. The other cline is east to west, with northern Italy being close to the West Mediterranean and southern Italy closer to the East Mediterranean. These differences happened long ago during pre-classical periods. Therefore, Italians have an old and illustrious background with influences from all over Europe, North Africa, and West Asia. This story is continuing to evolve. With each few months and years, new information in ancient DNA is being discovered and hopefully solving long-standing beliefs and mysteries. Italians, and really no humans on Earth, are pure. It's more about how isolated a group is than any perceived idea of purity. Another misconception is that a country represents an ethnic group. For example, if you are on a border of, say, France and Italy, one side is full of people wearing berets, red scarves, and eating baguettes, and the other side are people riding mopeds, eating spaghetti, and gesturing wildly with their hands. No, not really. These are cultural traits, negative stereotypes, and misunderstandings. Borders are often fluid with little differences on either side, and may be both speaking similar languages due to history and migration. Often, however, populations can actually be separated because of geographical barriers, such as mountains, rivers, and large body of water, or political borders that often separate gene flow. This is where history and archaeology are important to help us understand what the genes are telling us, and why commercial genetic companies often lack the ability to convey this ambiguity to their customer base. They're in the business of selling the idea that you will discover where your ancestors come from. What they later tell you is, oh yeah, this is an evolving science, and our data is evolving, so what we told you last year is different from what your results are now this year. They tend to dumb down the historical side of it, maybe by having a small paragraph or two of information, but still, using national boundaries as references, and generally confusing people who believe in the myth of national ethnic groups. It isn't only just Americans who are confused and shocked, but also many in this world who live in countries that nationalize their ethnic identity. For example, Turkish people who often share similar DNA with Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Kurds, who I might add at one point or another have been treated unfairly by the governments in power, have popped up in their DNA results. Thus the shocked YouTube DNA reveal videos. So let us begin from the beginning. We will be focusing on Europe, West Asia, and North African peoples. During the Ice Age, many tribes of people, all hunter-gatherers, lived in refugia in southern Europe and the Middle East. As the ice receded, pockets of these people reclaimed lands north. Some of these groups who lived in the taiga and the steppe south of the ice were mammoth hunters. When mammoths became extinct, they pursued other game such as reindeer and bison. None of these people were recognizably European at this time, physically and within their genes. During the Mesolithic period, we can categorize these groups into unique separate peoples. One we can call Western hunter-gatherers, coming from the refugia in Western Europe and migrating north. Those remains tested had unusual features because they had the mutation for dark skin, but surprisingly, with blue eyes. To the east, from southeastern Europe to the Baltic, is what we can label Eastern hunter-gatherers. Another group, which is called ANE, or Ancient Northern Eurasian, was discovered in Siberia. They named the remains Malta Boy. What is interesting is that he had DNA in common with Europeans, Central Asians, and Native Americans as well. There was population clusters of hunter-gatherers in Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, in the Caucasus Mountains, in the Levant, with Natufians, Northwest Africa, and Northeast Africa along the tribes in Saudi Arabia, Central Asia, and India. The Neolithic, or New Stone Age, had perhaps the strongest imprint on our genetics, along with the Bronze Age. The farming revolution started in the Middle East, Anatolia, and the Caucasus region. It seems at first these groups didn't mix, but they did exchange ideas. These Western Anatolians would spread west with the farming package. Their route into Europe was probably a two-pronged path, one up the Danube into Central Europe, and secondly into the Balkans, South Italy, called the Mediterranean route. Archaeologically speaking, they didn't mix at first with the hunter-gatherers in Europe, pushing them up to the less desirable, colder climes of Europe. Some groups lived side by side without hardly any admixture for centuries even. We know now that these Anatolian farmers not only brought with them farming, helping to create a familiar landscape in Europe today, but also the snips for light skin. They mostly had brown eyes and brown hair and were lactose intolerant, though it seems they did produce types of cheeses and yogurts. All Europeans have Anatolian farmer ancestry in them, with Mediterranean populations have up to 50% or more, and in northeastern Europe, the least. They spread to Spain, Ireland, Britain, Germany, Ukraine, all over southern Europe. The closest modern population today are in fact Sardinians. Sardinia is so far from the main events in history of Europe, being isolated on an island. Eventually, these farming communities would mix with the hunter-gatherers, especially in the western fringe of Europe. At the end of the Neolithic into the Chalcolithic, and also Bronze Age, we see major mixing and migrating events on a scale that only colonization in the modern era could compare with. In the Middle East, Levantine groups spread through the Middle East into North Africa, Caucasus herders into Anatolia, east towards Iran and India, and north into the Pontic steppe in Russia, mixing with hunter-gatherers there. Some of these mixed Anatolian Caucasus spread west into Anatolia, the Greek islands, and Cyprus, carrying maybe some minimal Levantine DNA. The biggest impact surely came from the steppe herders who came from Russia and Ukraine during a period of plague and bad harvest. These people were probably the first to domesticate the horse and spoke what are known now as the Indo-European languages. These languages include Greek, the Romance languages including Italian, Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, Armenian, Iranian, and Sanskrit derived languages in India. They pushed west into Europe and east into Persia and India. They were extremely patriarchal and warlike. Much Y-DNA in Europe derives from them, and up to 50% of their DNA in some cases. Much of their Y-DNA in Europe derives from them, and up to 50% of their autosomal DNA in some cases. This lowers as you go south into the Med, where population densities were higher. In the Bronze Age and Iron Age, the map of Italy would resemble a quilt of different tribes and nations. There are those who spoke pre-Indo-European languages in parts of Italy, and possibly for a long time. Italy is famously inaccessible. Every mountain valley today is a different language or dialect. However, the only groups to survive the Indo-Europeanization, or Romanization, were the Etruscans and Rhaetians in the north. There are theories that the Etruscans originally came from the eastern Mediterranean, but the archaeological data isn't there for this to be likely. The Romans themselves, it is proving, are indistinguishable from the neighboring Etruscans genetically. Next we have the Italics. These were several tribal and warlike peoples, including the Umbrians, Latins, and Oscans, and Lucanians, among many more. There seems to be a split from Latins and Oscan and Umbrians. It could be that they migrated south from northeastern Italy near the Alps, or they came over from the Balkans. They traveled as far south as Sicily and often fought amongst themselves as well as their neighbors. However, we need more ancient DNA to know what kind of admixture they carried to understand their origins. Other groups that aren't Italics, but may be closely related to them, are Ligurians to the west, the Messapians in Puglia, and Veneti to the east. In the south of Italy and Sicily during the Iron Age and Classical periods came the Greeks, especially from the Greek islands and from western Anatolia. The most famous monuments of the Hellenic world you can find in Sicily, Puglia, Calabria, Basilicata, and Campania. The Greek legacy and ruins in cities like Siracusa, Agrigento, and Napoli are the biggest outside of Greece. In a study published in 2017, shows that ancient Greek islanders' DNA closest matches were modern Sicilians and South Italians. The next group to enter into the mix in North Italy were the Celts, who sacked Rome. Cities like Milan and Bologna names of Celtic origin, just to name a few. Then, with a minimal influence but still there, were the Phoenicians, and later would become the Carthaginians. The Phoenicians were a Semitic people who came from the East Mediterranean and were expert sailors. They competed with Greeks for trade and also set up colonies, especially in the Western Mediterranean and North Africa. Their colonies weren't as populated as the Greek ones because their focus solely on trade. They created colonies in western Sicily and 2/3 of Sardinia. Carthage would take over from them in their home of Tunisia and would colonize Spain. Sicily and Sardinia were the first areas of dispute between the Romans and the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars. Racists from the 19th century, especially from Britain, Germany, and the USA, assumed that Italians used to be German-like until the Romans took so many slaves from the Middle East and Africa and mixed with them that it caused a breakdown of society and then the fall of the Roman world. Some of these assumptions are based on the fact that Northern Europeans weren't familiar with the Mediterranean world, and when exposed to Roman and Greek art and sculpture, they saw white marble or plaster without its color. This made them think that Romans were also white, and because of European colonization of the New World, Africa and Oceania, they needed to justify that they were behaving like Romans, and also warning themselves of the folly of race admixture. All of this is ridiculous, of course. Civilization comes from the Middle East and North Africa, and long-lasting civilizations grew and lasted in Africa, the Americas, and of course especially in East Asia. The truth is, the Romans, as they spread, incorporated the groups they conquered, and yes, making slaves out of many of them, but also making citizens out of them as well. There isn't much to go on now with DNA genetics and slaves, except some people who may have been slaves in some archaeological digs. Slavery in the Roman world is an uncomfortable truth for us now, but completely normal then. The Romans themselves were in a class system for the patrician class versus the plebeian class. Slaves were property. It wasn't until the social war that Italian peoples conquered by the Romans became marginally equal to them. But they did earn Roman citizenship. Slaves, if they were lucky, could gain citizenship also, depending on how loyal and worthy they were. We can't compare the race-based slave societies of the American South, Brazil, and Caribbean with the Roman system. Romans didn't care about race. Romans had slave markets, but they came from all over the Roman world, from Britain, the forests of Germania, Dacia, Syria, North Africa, etc. Most prized were Greek speakers from the Greek world, which was much bigger than it is today. It was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. A Greek speaker could teach the language and be an educator. Many were scientists and engineers. Even slaves who were bakers earned their freedom. Slaves who could fight might be gladiators, but the majority probably lived terrible lives, where their value was little more than chattel and sexual objects, and most probably died young, especially if you worked in the mines, or latifundi for big farm estates. Slaves were a big part of the population in Rome and throughout the Roman Empire, and basically, from their perspective, little more than household appliances. So how much of this has entered into the Italian gene pool? Apparently little, as papers have detailed. Most of the Italian DNA has not changed since the Bronze Age, though during the height of the empire there was definitely influence from the east. But as the empire's fortunes changed, this population declined and shifted to Constantinople in the Eastern Empire. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire to plague, climate change and barbarians from Germania and the Huns, the population declined dramatically. The Germanic peoples such as the Goths, Vandals, and Lombards seem to have only a little effect on the population, the North having had more of an impact. Then came groups of nomadic Avars and Bulgars to settle in Italy, but this even smaller and probably mostly men. Any DNA from these groups seem to have been diluted fairly quickly. The Arab occupation of Sicily did see a substantial immigrant population, but only contributed maybe 5 to 8% of Sicilian DNA. Plus, it wasn't only Arabs, it was mostly Berbers, Muslim Iberians, and converted Sicilians. Even still, it isn't comparable to the Greek influence on the island. Also, I can't forget the Jewish populations that lived throughout Italy for centuries. Jews were a prominent group since Roman times, and many, it is recorded, married Roman women who converted to boost up their numbers. This may be the case, being that European Jews, especially Ashkenazi, cluster close to Greeks and Italians. But in reality, intermarrying during the Christian period would have been rare and forbidden on both sides. DNA commercial companies have focused more on European DNA than other groups, and more specifically on Northwest Europeans, especially British Isles and Irish. That is who the market is for. Other Europeans are slowly taking interest in this phenomena, but it's primarily unpopular. In Italy, it's not popular, and I'm still trying to figure out why. Maybe it is because they already know their history and don't need a company from another country explaining it to them. Also, family history is a bit more private. For Italian Americans, I believe there might be a similar reluctance, though it is changing. It could be because in America, Italians were thought of as being inferior, so not doing a DNA test is like keeping those ancestral memories locked away, while at the same time keeping the image of assimilation with the main Anglo or white culture. That being said, Italian Americans are now doing the tests and discovering who they are. And now, here lies the problem. Somebody, say with 100% Calabrese roots, does a test and discovers that they are only maybe 50% Italian, but also West Asian, North African, Sephardic or Ashkenazi Jewish, and maybe a little Northwest European. It gives the impression that these are recent immigrants, or maybe the family story is wrong, or maybe a Turkish milkman visited a grandmother, but in reality, there are several possibilities. The problem is that people from Greece, the Balkans, Turkey, and the Middle East and North Africa share many similarities, and while people from Spain, Portugal, and Morocco might also share similarities, however small, the companies need more samples from these regions. This problem is similar to, say, German, English, and Dutch populations. It is hard for the companies to disentangle this information, but really, not all South Italians have a Turkish great-grandfather. It also doesn't mean that a few Saracen pirates impregnated half of Italy. The only solution is testing more Italians from all over the peninsula and islands, but also ancient DNA. As it is turning out, this ancient DNA is very similar to modern populations today, with only minor intrusions, so that Turks or Saracens could be actually farmers or migrants, colonists from the Neolithic, Bronze Age, or the barbarian migration period. Another problem, at least for Americans, is if you are, for example, Irish, German, and Italian, this might complicate the results. Testing is based on an algorithm and is much easier if all of your grandparents came from one village rather than multiple ethnicities. In Italy's case, each mountain valley could harbor linguistic and possibly ethnic differences. I hope I answered any questions you might have had about DNA, who we are, and where we come from. Until next time, arrivederci.